Hello and welcome to a new Fullstack tutorial in which I show you how to set up authentication and authorization for your web apps and services using APISIX and Keycloak. Both are well-established open source projects with an active community and a lot of features. The number of those features can be a bit overwhelming at first, and figuring out how to properly use both in production can be a bit daunting at first. It's why I decided to record this video and share what I've learned using those technologies. I'll start with a little overview showing the demo setup I'll use to explain how APISIX and Keycloak work. Then we'll dive in and work on the configuration, first adding authentication to our resources and then a role-based access control with a resource client in Keycloak. So let's start with the overview. Imagine we have some web app which needs access to 3 resources. So this is for our demo, just 3 simple resources, and in a standard setup without any authentication, authorization or proxies, you would have a channel going from web app to resource 1 to resource 2 to resource 3. So you would have to manage 3 different routes. And this is not an ideal setup, especially in modern cloud architectures, which is why you typically set up a reverse proxy. So this proxy would then be the single point of entry for web apps or other clients that require access to the resources of your, could be a microservices architecture or could be resource 1, imagine an API, then we have here some LLM resources, maybe some storage. Whatever this is, you've set up here. So with such a reverse proxy, you already channel the communication through one single component, which makes the setup we want to create here in this tutorial a lot simpler. And typically you would have HTTPS going in between web apps, clients to the reverse proxy, which could handle the termination. So this could be in a cloud setup. For example, in AWS, you could have this reverse proxy in a public subnet, so facing the internet, and then here the communication between proxy and resources. This is then sufficient to happen as HTTP, and you could have those resources in a private subnet for added security. So just making sure that this is really the only way somebody can access your resources is via this reverse proxy. Those resources are not accessible from the internet. So that's a typical setup. So this here is the foundation, to have HTTPS as the communication coming in from the internet to your system, which is proxied here through this component. Now, this doesn't include any authentication or authorization yet. For this, we need an identity provider. Now you could imagine, okay, I go in and have every resource talk to this identity provider when there are incoming requests and authenticate the user or the client that needs access to those resources. But this setup is not ideal because then you have to duplicate logic. Also, those resources might use different programming languages, so you need different libraries to handle this or different custom code. It's why instead of a simple reverse proxy, we use an API gateway. Such an API gateway can then do a little bit more than just routing requests, like a typical reverse proxy, like Nginx, for example. An API gateway can also directly communicate with your identity provider and do all the authentication and authorization logic for you. So the resources themselves do not need to include any of this logic. They can assume that any connection, incoming connection, any request is already authenticated and also authorized. And in our little demo here, we will use Keycloak as identity provider and APISIX as API gateway. Now here's a quick overview of Keycloak. So it's an open source IAM which supports single sign-on and identity brokering. It's under the Apache 2.0 license. Supports several standards, for example, OpenID Connect, Auth 2, and also SAML. User federation is included, so you can connect it via LDAP to an Active Directory. This is an interesting setup, for example, if you want to use it in some company, in some internal setup. You have fine-grained authorization. So this is something I'm going to show in this video. And via confidential clients and service accounts, you can also allow programmatic access via some secrets to your system. Then we have APISIX. It's also governed under the Apache 2.0 license. It's a fast open source API gateway. So it's built on top of OpenResty and Nginx with Lua JIT. This enables hot reloading, and also it allows you to write simple plugins or serverless functions using Lua, which is something that is very easy to learn. And yeah, you can make simple customizations to your setup where the provided plugins aren't enough to achieve what you want to do. And this is very important. You have a first-class OIDC Keycloak support, which you can use to get a simple setup, or you just follow me along because this is exactly what we're gonna set up in this video. And it works everywhere, so you can set it up as standalone with YAML. This is a setup I like to use in Kubernetes, where I already have a lot of YAML and configuration files, or you can also set it up with a user interface. This is something we won't do in this tutorial, so we will focus on the YAML setup. Now let's have a look at the demo. There's a link to this repository in the description below. We have a little README and then several folders. So if you check it out, make sure you have Docker installed on your system. If you have, what you can do, you can use the start script that's provided. If you're on a Windows system, I recommend that you install the git bash because this allows you to run SH scripts. This script starts the services that I've defined here in this Docker Compose file. So you can have a look how it's set up. We're defining an API gateway with several environment variables. Some of those come directly from this .env file, so that's recommended if you set up APISIX that you parameterize everything. Also, if you set it up for Kubernetes, you would also have those secrets stored in Kubernetes and then provided via environment variables in your templates. We have some volumes which we're mounting here. So for example, this APISIX config is something we're gonna have a very close look at because this is where we define all the routes, the authentication and the authorization, and here the ports. So I map it to port 80 because I just want to access the demo at localhost. Then we have the IAM service, which is Keycloak. Again, some environment variables with a very simple password here for the database. You would obviously set this up differently in production, but for now, those two are just the link here to a Postgres database. Typically, you set up Keycloak with Postgres, so you have a secure storage of your users and credentials and everything. And then down here, I have a few resources. Those are very simple. I'm just using very simple HTML pages, which are just served via 3 separate Nginx services. So I've set it up like this just for this demo. For you, just imagine you have some API with different endpoints, or you have some LLMs you want to access, some storage, which you put behind our API gateway. Those could also be your resources. But here for the demo, those 3 will suffice. Let's have a look now that everything has started here. And here you already see when I go to localhost, I'm directly transported here to this login. Now, if we look up here, this is under /im realms demo. This is already a Keycloak route. And don't worry, I'll explain everything about this in this video. Let's first log in here. I've created a test user with a simple test password, and we directly end up here at resource 1. So localhost/resource. So here's the first thing. I went to localhost and I'm now at resource 1. That's a basic redirection which you can set up in APISIX, very similar to what you could do in Nginx itself. Now here we can go to the other resources and I've color-coded them similar to the presentation. And down here we have a logout button, and now we're back to the sign in. So this is what I will show you how to set this up, and we'll also go a step further and do some authorization. So some users have access to resource 1, others have access to resource 2, stuff like that. But first, let's start with a blank slate. Now I cleaned all the configurations, and now if we go to localhost, what we get is just this error here, routes not found. The reason for this is that I've now completely emptied the APISIX.yaml so we can begin filling it together. And one thing I first want to look at is the config.yaml. So that's the second very important file when you use APISIX. We don't have set up much here, just where to listen. So port 9080, which we map to port 80. Then we have some setup here, deployment, role data plane, and config provider YAML. That's very important if we want to use such a YAML file during startup, and if we don't require the user interface, the admin interface, which would also need an etcd container in addition to APISIX. So as I said, I prefer this standalone setup with a YAML file. Then here we can do some Nginx config, including the error levels. And this is something important. Currently, worker processes, I have set this to auto, which is fine for my local setup, but you're gonna run into trouble if you leave it like that and then deploy in a Kubernetes cluster. Such a Kubernetes cluster could have many, many resources, yet only a part of those resources is reserved for your environment. So imagine in a company where you have an internal setup, where you have maybe 1000 CPUs in the complete cluster, yet you just get a part of it, maybe 8 CPUs CPUs. This auto would then refer to the complete set of CPUs it finds in this cluster. And yeah, this would lead to problems because now it would try to create more than 1,000 worker processes. So in a Kubernetes cluster, it's better to add a fixed value here. And down here, that's important. The number of plugins that APISIX provides is huge. We just need a selection, and we're going to go through what those do in a second. Now let's have a look in the documentation, which is very good. You have here under plugins a list of all the plugins you have. So for example, there are several AI proxy plugins, general plugins, and what we use here, the authentication stuff, which also includes this OpenID Connect and the Auth Keycloak. So I show you how to set this up. And you have some security, traffic, observability. So just have a look. It's a whole lot of plugins. And we will now start with a very simple one. As I said, I want to have the routes, the different resources set up under resource 1, resource 2, and resource 3, like I showed you. The first thing what we want to do here is we want to create a first route here for our resource 1. So first we give it an ID, resource 1, those need to be unique. Then here we define the URI, so where the resources should be located. So for example, requests to localhost /resource1/ and then anything coming afterward would be routed to this upstream, which is our resource 1 service at port 80. So this is what we're running in Docker Compose. I want to quickly show you, you could also do this URIs. So basically have an array and then say also resource 1 would go to the same upstream. So not just resource 1 with a slash, with a /, but also resource 1. So you can provide an array here. So those are the options. And that's now a very simple route. And when I save it, have it running now with hot reloading as a default, I can just go back to the browser and go to /resource1. So now we get a 404 not found. And let me explain why this happens. So if I go to this /resource1 and have this as the upstream, what we would access on the upstream would be resource 1. And this does not exist on the upstream. On the upstream, I have the index.html directly at this URL. So what I need to do is to create a rewrite proxy here. So I can use a plugin, use a regex here, which helps me to drop everything here and just forward to / and then everything that comes here in this capture group. So when I save this, and let's just remove this, this was just to show you which URL contains our index. Go back to the browser and now press enter, it works. And also if I use / or /index.html. Now this works fine, but still the other resource, if I go to resource 2, this will not work because we haven't yet set them up. So let's just do this. I just do some copy and paste here, then renaming it resource 2. And here we have resource 3. Save it. And now I have another look. And now I can switch between the resources. Now this part here obviously doesn't yet work. We're going to handle this later. But first what we want to do, you saw in the demo, if I go to localhost alone, press enter, there's nothing at this route. So it's a 404. So we can use another plugin and create a forwarding. So I call this one ID route forward for the URI / and here I do the redirect to resource 1. Now with this redirect route in place, let's go back to the browser, press enter, and now it works. Now because this video is already dragging on a bit, I want to make a cut here and then have a second video in which we're going to focus on adding authentication. Because now we have set up the basic routing and also the forwarding so we can access our resources. This is basically what I showed in the beginning in the presentation, where we just have a simple reverse proxy, but not yet any means to authenticate and authorize access. Now, next video will focus completely on setting up Keycloak and integrating it into our system. So stay tuned for that. And I have a link to this repo. So if you don't want to wait, you can already have a look at that and play around with it. See you in the next video.